What would you do if the country you helped liberate suddenly turned into your worst nightmare? In the autumn of 2019, the vibrant streets of Johannesburg became a landscape of fear for Nigerian immigrants. As buildings burned and shops were looted, a desperate plea for help echoed across the continent. This is not just a story of migration, it is a gripping account of a daring rescue operation that brought 130 citizens home from the brink of tragedy. For decades, Nigeria and South Africa shared a bond forged in the fires of liberation. During the dark years of apartheid, Nigeria was a frontline state in spirit, providing passports, education, and millions of dollars to those fighting for freedom. This history makes the events of 2019 even more painful. In the townships of Gauteng, a new generation, frustrated by poverty and unemployment, began to look for scapegoats. They found them in their fellow Africans, specifically the Nigerian community. By mid-September, the violence had reached a fever pitch. Visuals of mob justice flooded social media, showing shops being looted and cars set ablaze in the central business districts. These were not just statistics, they were the livelihoods of thousands of Nigerians who had invested everything into their small businesses. The tension crossed the ocean, sparking retaliatory threats back in Lagos. The continent watched in horror as the two largest economies in Africa teetered on the brink of a diplomatic war. Inside the Nigerian consulate in Johannesburg, the phone lines were jammed with calls from terrified citizens. Men and women reported being trapped in their apartments while mobs patrolled the hallways. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and the sound of breaking glass. It became clear that the local authorities were struggling to contain the chaos. The Nigerian government faced a choice: leave their people to fate or find a way to bring them home immediately. In Nigeria, the public outcry was deafening. Protesters gathered in the streets of Lagos and Abuja, demanding action. Some even targeted South African-owned businesses in retaliation, forcing the government to call for calm. The narrative of African brotherhood was being torn apart in real time. President Muhammadu Buhari sent a special envoy to meet with Cyril Ramaphosa, but for the citizens hiding in their homes, high-level diplomacy was moving far too slowly for their desperate circumstances on the ground. That is when a private citizen stepped into the gap. A charismatic Nigerian airline CEO announced that his company would provide free flights for any Nigerian wishing to return home. It was a massive logistical undertaking and a significant financial sacrifice. He declared that he could not stand by and watch his compatriots being slaughtered. This move changed the dynamic of the crisis, turning a story of victimization into a narrative of national pride and a daring rescue operation. The logistical challenge was immense. Hundreds of people had to be verified, documented, and safely transported to Otambo International Airport. Many had lost their travel documents in the fires or had expired visas. The Nigerian High Commission worked around the clock to issue emergency travel certificates. There was a constant fear that the buses transporting the evacuees would be attacked on the way to the airport, requiring a high level of coordination and secret security measures. As the sun rose on the day of the first flight, the atmosphere at the airport was tense. 130 Nigerians gathered in a restricted terminal, away from the main crowds. They were a cross-section of society: students, petty traders, and families with young children. Some had lived in South Africa for over a decade, while others had arrived only months earlier. All of them shared one thing in common: the haunting desire to touch Nigerian soil again. The bureaucratic hurdles did not end at the airport gates. South African immigration officials reportedly insisted on checking every single passenger for outstanding fines or criminal records, a process that dragged on for hours. The plane sat on the tarmac, its engines idling, as the sun began to set. Inside the cabin, the passengers waited in silence, praying that nothing would stop them from leaving. Every minute felt like an eternity as they remained in the country that rejected them. Finally, the clearance was given. The doors of the Boeing 777 were sealed. As the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, a collective sigh of relief filled the cabin. For many, this was the first time they had felt safe in weeks. They were leaving behind their businesses, their homes, and their furniture, but they were taking their lives with them. As the wheels left the ground, the glittering lights of Johannesburg faded into the dark African night below. The flight back to Lagos was unlike any other. There were no movies playing, and few people slept. Instead, The cabin was filled with the sound of whispered stories. Passengers shared accounts of narrow escapes and the heartbreak of seeing their dreams turn to ashes. One man spoke of his grocery store in Pretoria, built over 5 years and destroyed in 5 minutes. Despite the loss, there was an unmistakable sense of camaraderie and a shared identity as Nigerians. As the plane crossed into Nigerian airspace, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming the citizens back to their fatherland. The reaction was instantaneous. People began to sing the national anthem, their voices rising in a powerful chorus that echoed through the fuselage. Tears streamed down faces as the reality of their homecoming set in. They were no longer foreigners or targets, they were citizens returning to a nation that had reached out to save them. In Lagos, the Murtala Muhammad International Airport was buzzing with anticipation. Government officials, journalists, and anxious family members crowded the arrival hall. The news of the evacuation had become a national event, a symbol of Nigeria's refusal to be bullied. When the wheels finally touched down on the Lagos runway, the passengers erupted into cheers and applause. They had traveled thousands of miles across the continent to find the peace that had been denied to them abroad. The doors opened to the humid night air of Lagos. The first group of evacuees stepped onto the mobile stairs, greeted by the flash of cameras and the cheers of airport staff. Many knelt down to kiss the tarmac, a gesture of profound gratitude for their survival. They were tired, some were injured, and all were penniless, but the look of pure joy on their faces told a story that words could never fully capture. They were finally home. Among the 130 people was a young man named Jude, who had lost his electronics shop in Durban. He stood on the tarmac with only a plastic bag containing his passport and a few photos. Like many others, Jude was processing the trauma of the past week. He spoke to reporters about the betrayal he felt, having considered South Africans his brothers. His story was a microcosm of the larger tragedy unfolding across the southern African region. The Nigerian government provided each returnee with a small stipend and cellular airtime to contact their relatives. Buses were lined up to take them to a reception center where they would receive medical checkups and temporary housing. For the government, this was a moment of diplomatic triumph, proving they could protect their citizens anywhere in the world. However, for the evacuees, the road ahead was uncertain. They had to rebuild their lives from scratch in a struggling economy. Back in South Africa, the evacuation sent a shockwave through the political landscape. President Ramaphosa was forced to apologize to the Nigerian people, sending a team of special envoys to Abuja to mend fences. He admitted that the violence was a stain on the nation's reputation and contrary to the values of the Rainbow Nation. Yet, critics argued that the root causes of the xenophobia, inequality and poor service delivery were still not being addressed by the government. The crisis also sparked a deep conversation about the Afrophobia rising in many parts of the continent. It challenged the romanticized idea of Pan-Africanism, showing that national borders and economic competition could easily override the bonds of shared history. Why did Africans feel more threatened by their neighbors than by those from other continents? The 2019 evacuation became a case study for sociologists and political scientists trying to understand the fragile nature of unity in a post-colonial Africa. In the months following the rescue, the airline CEO was hailed as a national hero. His intervention showed the power of the private sector in times of national crisis. It also highlighted the failures of traditional diplomacy, which often gets bogged down in protocol while lives are at stake. This evacuation wasn't just a flight, it was a statement that Nigerian lives mattered, and that the nation would go to great lengths to ensure their safety and their dignity. But what of those who stayed behind? Thousands of Nigerians chose to remain in South Africa, unable to walk away from the lives they had built over decades. They lived in a state of constant vigilance, knowing that the next spark could ignite the streets once again. The evacuation had saved 130, but it left behind a community that felt increasingly isolated. The scars of the 2019 riots would take a generation to fully heal. The story of the evacuation is also a story of the Nigerian spirit, the resilience to start over and the refusal to be broken. Many of the returnees eventually found their footing back in Nigeria, starting small businesses or reuniting with their families in the villages. They carried with them the lessons of their time abroad, the importance of a strong homeland and the reality that safety is never guaranteed, even in a land that calls you brother. Diplomatically, the relationship between Nigeria and South Africa remains a complex dance of cooperation and competition. They are the two pillars of the African Union, yet they are often at odds. The 2019 crisis forced both nations to confront the dark undercurrents of their relationship. While trade has continued and formal apologies were made, the underlying tensions of migration and economic dominance continue to simmer just beneath the surface of official handshakes and photo opportunities. Today, we remember the 130 who boarded that plane as symbols of a larger struggle. Their journey is a reminder that the African story is one of movement, conflict, and ultimately, survival. The 2019 evacuation was a moment when a nation stood up for its own, proving that even in the face of fire and hatred, there is always a way home. It remains a definitive moment in the history of Nigerian foreign policy and citizens' rights. The evacuation of 130 Nigerians from South Africa remains a somber chapter in the history of modern Africa. It serves as a stark reminder that the dream of a borderless, united continent is still a work in progress. As the planes landed and the crowds dispersed, the deeper wounds of economic inequality and social frustration remained unhealed. The story of those who fled is a call for leadership, empathy, and a return to the spirit of brotherhood.